Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, and GIZ Felicity. My name is Alicia Davila. I'm head of communications at CPI, which is the Alliance Secretariat, and I'm delighted to be the moderator of today's session, which I know is going to provide a rich discussion. Before we get started, I do want to note a few housekeeping items. First off, if you are calling by phone to this session, we will be sharing slides during it, and you can find these slides on our event page at citiesclimatefinance.org. I'll ask one of my colleagues to please share that link in the chat box now. The first part of the session will feature a presentation on the policy brief and also reactions directly from representatives, development banks, and other experts. Following this, we'll feature audience question and answer. I really would like to encourage you to share your thoughts on this topic and questions for speakers throughout the session in the chat function. And we have set aside quite some time for Q&A, and I'll do my best to get to all of these questions during the discussion, and otherwise we'll be integrating them into the summary and key takeaways from today's event. All participants will be muted during the session. However, we would encourage you to edit your name to include your organization in parentheses if you wish, and you can do that by right-clicking on your name in Zoom. I'd also like to remind you that the session is being live streamed and recorded and is available at citiesclimatefinance.org. And again, my colleague will share that link in the chat function now so that if you'd like to share insights from the event on social media or otherwise, you're able to do so. So with that, we will begin. And to kick us off, it is my pleasure to introduce Inga Bay. Inga is an advisor at GIZ, managing the Financing Energy for Low Carbon Investment, or FELICITY program, and is a close partner with the city's Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. So Ms. Bay, I'll invite you to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also a warm welcome from my side. And Priscilla has asked me to briefly outline the reason behind this commissioning of the paper. And for that, maybe let me very briefly introduce Felicity to you. So Felicity is a joint initiative by GIZ and the European Investment Bank, focusing on supporting cities in developing their urban infrastructure projects. And we have three components. And the first one, which is really the core of Felicity, is supporting cities and project promoter in developing and structuring their urban projects with a view to link it to finance. The second component addresses national framework conditions. And in that component, we support national level policies where it fits with the projects we support. So for example, we supported guidelines on energy efficiency projects in a country where we supported cities in their energy efficiency projects. And the last component is focusing on global partnerships and advisory support to the German Environment Ministry. That's the component that I'm leading within Felicity. So yeah, why did we commission this paper? And that is basically because we realized over the course of the first month and years of implementing Felicity that we increasingly started working with national development banks in our support to the cities. Of course, one of the reasons is that our partner, the European Investment Bank, has several framework loans with national development banks that are supporting our cities or out of the pipeline of the development banks that we support cities. And second, of course, because the cities that we are supporting wanted to secure finance from a national development bank. And thirdly, what we didn't expect, that we received a couple of requests from national development banks to receive capacity development and training for their own staff in several areas. For example, procurement, procedures, climate risk vulnerability assessments, and similar things. So that basically led us to ask, okay, so we see the great potential and need of national development banks to support cities and project promoters in their development of projects. But then the question was, do they really have the capacities and the resources needed as national development banks to do so? And unfortunately, the request we received was oftentimes out of the scope of Felicity support. However, we took up that topic when we supported the BMU in developing Lucy, and I think Priscilla will briefly outline that initiative later, that it was this initiative kicked off at the Climate Summit last year, and the role of national development banks and national framework conditions is a component of Lucy. In that regard, we really did a scoping and tried to find out, are there initiatives already working closely with NDBs across the globe, focusing on urban infrastructure? And we couldn't find too many, to be honest. And also looking at research papers, again, we found a lot outlining the relevance of national development banks for achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. But then again, none of the papers we found at that point was really focusing on urban infrastructure. So yeah, that's where we were, and that's where we thought CCFLA is really a key platform for us to kick off that discussion, to have a short paper, and that is now longer than we initially thought it would be, but to really have a short paper to share with you and to get the community together and just discuss really openly, what are the barriers? Are there barriers for NDBs to support cities, to support urban infrastructure projects? Are there capacity constraints within NDBs? What should be done so this potential that NDBs have can really be used? So that's what brought us here. I hope you find that paper and that topic as timely as we did. And I'm personally very much looking forward to the discussion with you. Yeah, looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bay. Thank you for that very helpful context setting as well, noting that the paper is longer than we expected, but that's because there's quite a rich discussion there. So I now just want to immediately turn to my colleague, Priscilla Negreiros, who's a manager of the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance here at CPI, to further discuss our findings.
Great, thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Inga, so much for your initial words. But well, hi everyone, very happy to be here today representing the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance Secretariat to launch and yes, present our new policy brief in enhancing the role of national development banks in supporting climate-smart urban infrastructure. Needless to say, but I would like to reinforce that this work, of course, wouldn't be possible without the support of FELICITY-GIZ. Thank you, Inga, again, and Sarah Conway, our leading author, and the Alliance's main funder, so the German government through BMU and BMZ. So I know that most of you know the work that we are doing in the Alliance, but I would like to take anyway this opportunity to briefly present the Alliance. So we are, the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance is a coalition of leaders committed to deploy finance for city-level climate action at scale by 2030. So we were created in 2014 within the UN Secretary General Office, and since 2019, it has been led by CPI, so Climate Policy Initiative. So the Alliance is a multi-level and a multi-stakeholder coalition, and we aim at making it the platform for coordination, partnership, and advocacy in this very niche cities climate finance space. So in this next slide, you can see that we have around 60 members, from city networks to public and private financial institutions, to national governments and research organizations, foundations, UN institutions. So a lot of the players, the main players of this area, and all of them have in common the mission of promoting more finance to urban climate transitions in cities. So as Inga mentioned, I wanted to highlight that the Alliance is hosting the Leadership for Urban Climate Investment Initiative that we call it LUCY, which was launched at the last year's UN Secretary General Climate Action Summit in the leadership with the leadership from BMU, the German government. And LUCY sets concrete targets, so to achieve ambitious indicators. You can see some of those in our slides. And this policy brief is also aimed at promoting knowledge, as Inga said, and achieving some of these LUCY indicators. So, well, no further delay, I'll dive into the topic that has brought us here today. Please, if you haven't seen the policy brief yet, it's already available in the Alliance and the CPI's website. So please, I invite you all to go there and download it while we are talking. And I will start with the same question that Inga started with. So why a policy brief on national development banks and urban climate smart infrastructure, but maybe giving a complementary answer. So first, the urgent need to attract climate investment to cities. So we know, and I think most of you have heard hundreds of times this number. So more than 50% of the world's population resides in urban areas today. This number would be expected to rise to 70% in 2050. So cities are already today responsible for roughly 70% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And yet the amount of funding that cities need to build this climate transition is far from what is needed. Today we have the numbers that we know for today is that the green infrastructure investment needed would be around $5 trillion per year. We are investing half of that sum. Well, with COVID-19, I don't need to tell anyone here again that this story gets a little bit more complicated. So we have the need for climate investment that remains the same, but the cities have fewer and fewer revenue sources that they can use themselves for this transition. And we are seeing a smaller appetite for risk from the private sector. So this policy brief, as it was mentioned, so it's a small step for us to learn a little bit more about opportunities and challenges for NDBs in that field, and also for the Alliance and its members to start working hand in hand with those institutions to attract more investment for climate smart urban infrastructure. So when we are talking about climate smart urban infrastructure, I want to just clarify that we are using a specific definition. So first is an infrastructure that is building in resilience to risk of climate change projected during their lifetimes. And secondly is an infrastructure with countries that is consistent with countries' adopted climate targets, holding the average global warming under 2 degrees Celsius. But to implement this needed change to retain global warming within these international targets, cities face many challenges. So highlighting some, and you can see all of those in more detail in our policy brief. So first, I think are the framework conditions. And I know that our panelists and participants will talk more about that, but we know that national regulations often hamper direct lending from cities and municipalities in different countries. And also there is a lack of capacity to integrate climate in infrastructure planning in cities. So this framework conditions brings a lot of challenges to cities to have access to those funds. Even when the cities actually have in place framework conditions, they may face challenges on the project level, which is limited capacity to structure urban infrastructure projects. They are often very complicated and need a lot of technical knowledge. We also see a lack of bankable project pipelines, which impedes the cities to have attract private investment. And consequently, this leads to many challenges in the investment level. So I would just highlight, of course, the lack of suitable investment instruments. So we are working in this paper because we think national development banks could be a potential source, intermediary, and a potential partner on this space. And first, let's define what we are talking about when we say national development bank. So we are using a World Bank definition for the policy brief, which is any type of financial institution that a national government fully or partially owns or controls, and has been given the explicit legal mandate to reach socioeconomic goals in a region, sector, or market segment. So taking this definition on, we know that there are more than 200, between 250 to as many as 400 national development banks, depending on definition. Some of them, for the research that exists there, 60% would be in middle income country, while only 8% are located in low income countries and around 30 in high income countries. So what I want to highlight here in this slide is basically there isn't one type of national development bank. We know that they share some commonalities as a group, but they differ in several dimensions. So ownership structure, some are fully, others are partially government owned, their mandate, their business lending models, the credit conditions that they establish, their size, and also their governance. So some are more independent versus others that are have more governance control boards. So national development banks are different among themselves and then might have different mandates. Yet, we do think that they are in a good position and very well positioned to support urban climate infrastructure. And here are some of the answers why. So first, local knowledge. So national development banks often have singular domestic focus, so they know and they participate in the country's development planning efforts. So this extensive knowledge of the barriers and opportunity to investment is often key to tackle and to launch other investments to cities. They often have long-standing relationship with local public and private sector, and they have sectorial expertise in a lot of times. So this local knowledge is key to support urban climate investment infrastructure. Also, a lot of those banks have many sources of funding, so they are able to access international markets, which a lot of cities cannot, institutional investors, official development assistance, and they are also able sometimes, of course, to have access to budget transfer from their governments. This access of funding helps them to better intermediate, for example, multilateral development bank funds, multilateral climate funds, and bilateral funding. So more specific on the finance issue, another point that we want to raise as an opportunity for national development banks in this area is local currency. So a lot of developing countries have difficulties in accessing international markets because the risk of borrowing in dollars or euros or another currency is very big. So they work with the local currency, which would help with those risks. NDBs can lend directly to municipalities who often lack access to long-term commercial finance options. And also they are able to assemble tailored finance packages to meet specific project needs. So basically we go to the fourth point where we think national development banks are well positioned, which is they can pull different types of funding and blended finance structure and often catalyze private sector investment. But although we think national development banks are in a very well position, they also face some challenges. And I think one of the reasons for this think piece was trying to understand which are those challenges and what are the opportunities. So I will mention some and invite you again to read the policy brief. On the institutional side, I think one of the main reasons will be clearly the lack of clear mandate to promote climate change programs. So a lot of the banks don't have in their mandate that they should work with climate change. And if we think about urban climate change, it could be even more rare. So therefore, we see in the institutional part also a lack of capacity to identify and access climate-smart urban infrastructure projects. More on the finance side, so in terms of barriers, we see that some smaller NDBs cannot afford to invest in major infrastructure investments. They require significant upfront capital. And there is also a lack of financial instruments to attract a wide range of investor types, so especially private investors. So basically what we try to do with this policy brief is come up with some recommendations. That's exactly what we want to present and discuss with you all today. So first, let me just make a point that there are a number of ways of enhancing the role of national development banks. And some of those could be led by national development banks themselves, but we know that others require involvement and support by a lot of different actors. So national and local governments, bilateral cooperation agencies, multilateral development banks, among others. So within CFLA, the Alliance, we know that we are in a key position to actually help a lot of different institutions to come together and find some of that solution. So it's also a big and a large reason why we are doing this work together. So on the recommendations, first on the national development banks, we think they can access, they must assess the current status of key institutional factors. So they should revise mandates and policies, their financial product offerings and support for infrastructure. And of course, as necessary, prioritize climate-related investments. So if not prioritize, not preclude. So the mandate points that I mentioned earlier is very important. Another recommendation would be to seek accreditation and support for international climate funds. So NDBs, international finance institutions, all these networks have capacity to secure one, concessional climate finance, but also technical assistance. So this is a very important point. Also, to national development banks, develop and deploy additional product offerings, and like project preparation facilities, risk mitigation instruments, and other instruments. This aims at addressing some of the barriers that I mentioned before. And finally, enhance collaboration with relevant national and local government entities. So with that, I jump to the other column where we have some recommendations to national and local governments. I think one is, as we mentioned before, assess the current status of regulatory framework. We know that even if some cities and local governments wants to change the frameworks, they have some legal impediments there. So we need to robust this ClimateSmart urban infrastructure investment and improve as much as possible the access from international entities and networks when necessary. So second, ensure the NDBs are included in relevant policy and planning efforts so they know what is happening and they can better work with the institutions. And of course, provide TA support for project sponsor. This is a point that we are highlighting a lot. Finally, I'll finalize with the international public finance institutions. So for multilateral, regional, bilateral development banks, and we will have CAF discussing with us soon too, provide support for local governments to improve this framework conditions that we are talking so much. So for the NDBs to enhance capacities relating to scaling up ClimateSmart urban infrastructure. And finally, collaborate with the NDBs themselves to extend the credit lines, concessional finance, and other financing approaches. So we are providing recommendations for a lot of different actors, but we didn't forget ourselves. So we also think that CCFLA and the Alliance and Lucy actually can play a very important role in this topic by convening the key players, including the NDBs themselves, so national, local governments, and other stakeholders that can make a change and improve the way the national development banks are working with cities. We also know, and we are starting with this paper to raise awareness about urban climate finance needs and opportunities and the role of NDBs in doing so. And therefore, I think we have Laurie will talk a little bit about that, but through our action groups, we are developing another work to go a little bit deeper into the study of national development banks. We also think we have to motivate action by setting clear and quantifiable targets to NDB. So we are working on that also under Lucy. And finally, tracking and analyzing the contribution for NDBs to urban low carbon climate resilient development. So basically everyone has its homework and would like to debate, hear from you, and work together to solve some of the barriers and issues I have mentioned. Thank you so much. Up to you, Alicia.
Thank you, Priscilla. So much to think about here and very helpful. So really appreciate the presentation. We are extremely pleased to not only have this great new research on this issue, but also some perspectives on the line from those working much more directly with national development banks or even in national development banks. So we have with us Ms. Boitumelo Mosako, the Chief Financial Officer of the Development Bank of South Africa, as well as Mr. Edgar Salinas, Executive Principal of Environment and Climate Change Division at the Development Bank of Latin America, or CAF, as well as someone who brings the perspective at the city level, Ms. Ana Jaime, Advisor on Public Investment and Financing at the Institute of Research and Urban Planning of Curitaba in the city of Curitaba, Brazil. So we will actually go to each of these experts in turn to hear, are these challenges and solutions and recommendations some of the right ones? What's your perspective from working more directly with national development banks, and how has your institution seen some of the bright spots in the world here that we can further replicate? So with that, I'll turn over to Ms. Mosaka.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Good afternoon, good morning to everybody on this call. I'm from the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and we have a mandate that extends beyond Southern Africa. It actually extends to the sub-Saharan region as well. And, in terms of our strategic objective as the bank is to actually catalyze infrastructure investment. We focus on sectors in the transport, energy, ICT, water, housing, and health, and education as well. Now, and we play a critical role in a sense that we play along the value chain. We plan for infrastructure. We actually assist cities and intermediary cities, in terms of planning for their infrastructure. We also implement infrastructure on behalf of cities and national government departments. We do project preparation. We also fund infrastructure as the bank. Now, this paper is timely indeed, because when you actually, look at the barriers, to be able to embed climate fundamentals in infrastructure, they are really, real. But we as the bank, see this as a time of great opportunity. The reason I say that is when you look at the region we are from, being from South Africa and Africa, there's a significant infrastructure backlog. And the opportunity that is there is how we then embed, climate aspects in our infrastructure decisions, are going forward, and that is going to be quite key. We as the bank have actually made a lot of progress in this space. We do have a unit within the bank, a climate finance unit within the bank. We've also developed policies around climate finance. In addition to that, we have secured facilities from the Global Climate Facility and the GEF as well. And and this goes back to one of the recommendations, in the paper around how to leverage these funds that are available. And one of the things that we've done as well is we've adopted, in accessing these funds, we've adopted a programmatic approach, as opposed to, accessing funds on a project by project basis. What we do is we actually have a program approach where we then say, we are actually, implementing a climate facility program focusing on, commercializing technologies in the infrastructure space, and a program on embedded generation. Now, how does this all link to cities? One of our biggest clients, obviously, as a national, as a development finance institution, is the support we provide our cities. I mean, we fund, cities in the country, and we see a great opportunity here around, project preparation in terms of supporting our cities, in that respect. Another thing I'd like to raise is the opportunity we have, is that of being able to play the role of catalyzing and also being an integrator. By that I mean, when you talk about the restrictions around, the policy framework, the funding, being owned by the South African government, for instance, we have a great opportunity to then say, how do we, start driving some of the regulatory changes that actually have to be made, using our stakeholder network being government owned. And this is one of the key, the key barrier that has been, identified. So we are rightly positioned to do that. Obviously, the scale of infrastructure investment we're talking about is massive. And the NDB cannot do it on its own. And in addition to that, there's also fiscal constraints. So there has to be, innovation around financial instruments that are actually used to then be able to do this, and to also have the de-risking mechanisms, to then allow the private sector to actually, participate in this infrastructure, investments that are, adaptive and resilient to climate. Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you so much. Very insightful. So we heard some of the things where DBSA is certainly a leader, including having specific units on this issue, a programmatic approach, and working directly with cities on project preparation, as well as some issues with one of the main recommendations on the mandate and how that may not be directly in your control either. So I'll now turn to Edgar Salinas for your reactions, Mr. Salinas.
Hi, thank you, Elisha. Before the start, I'd like to thank FELICITY-GIZ and also the city's Climate Finance and Leadership Alliance. I'm very honored to be here today, sharing this exchange with colleagues from DBSA, a long-standing friend in the context of the IDFC, and of course with Anna from Curitiba, very progressive city here in Brazil. My name is Edgar Salinas. I work with the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF. I'm based in Brasilia. And before I start, I'll share with you briefly what CAF does in terms of financial services for infrastructure in cities. We do work with infrastructure projects in many areas, such as transportation, water, sanitation, and sanitation in the larger context, and that includes solid waste management as well as water treatment. Urban interventions is one of the most relevant areas of investments for the bank, and for that specific purpose, we have created an initiative that is an institutional program whose main purpose is to promote a holistic approach for urban interventions. So that means that whenever we are called to provide finance for urban projects and programs, we focus on the efficiencies in urban planning. So that means how that intervention it is placed in the context of the city. Whether it is in any of those areas that I mentioned earlier, transportation, sanitation, etc. That project should have, as per this initiative, a focus on productivity, promotion of local economies, energy efficiency, and resilience. And resilience in the larger context also, not only resilience against climate change risk, but urban resilience, citizenship, and again, that emphasis on productivity. Another aspect that I would like to share with you in respect to what CAF does with cities is the services related to intermediation. So working with local banks. In the context of the paper, you call it the national development banks. Within the IDFC, we have been discussing the concept of public development banks. And sorry for the acronym. The IDFC is the International Development Finance Club. That is a large organization of development financial institutions. We are about 25 financial institutions. DBSA is a partner of that initiative, as well as CAF. So there we have been discussing that integration between the DFIs or NDBs, depending on how you see it and how you define it, and those public development banks. So in respect to the intermediation services, that goes hand in hand with the conclusions of the paper. It's very true what Priscilla mentioned earlier about the local knowledge of those banks, and in particularly here in Brazil, there is a conclusion in the paper that relates very much to the realities of the federal union. and it says many cities, especially in developing economies, lack access to international credit markets. Here, Brazil has 27 states and about 5,000 municipalities. Out of those 5,000 municipalities, few of them have the fiscal capacity to take a credit and loans with international organizations like CAF, the IDB, World Bank, etc. So there is where we have alliances with local banks at the state level, not only BNDES, which is cited in the paper. BNDES is a very large organization, but we work with local banks in Sao Paulo, the south of Brazil, the north, and they do have a mandate to work with municipalities. So the partnership that we have so far created is such that we provide services so that they can have a proper reporting, because most of those credit lines that between CAF and those banks are dedicated to energy efficiency, renewables, sanitation to a certain extent, and we do want them to report back to us those interventions that contribute to a green economy or also climate change. And that's a challenge to make those reporting systems compatible across the value chain. And so for that, we have a special dedicated resources to help those intermediate banks to develop their processes and procedures so that they understand when an intervention is addressing a climate change issue. That's very important, and I couldn't agree more with that conclusion of the paper. Now, you may wonder that if those small cities, if they don't have the fiscal capacity from the union to engage with international institutions, you may think that they have a greater risk, and as such, the financial services could be more expensive to compensate for that risk. But there is a very interesting piece of legislation in Brazil on which the guarantee that they would have with those local banks is based on the revenue stream from a tax collection system. And in that sense, all risk is taken away. So that is a very interesting module or protocol that they have, so that that enable us to have more business with those local banks, and those local banks can address infrastructure needs in those cities, especially those that address climate change risk, and of course energy efficiency in the sense of mitigation. I'll leave it there. With me today, I saw one of my colleagues from the urban team. We can take any questions and we can keep discussing. One final recommendation that I would like to put on the table is that the paper is very good. It brings complex concepts and challenges in simple words. I think it is a great accomplishment that you managed to pack everything in those 23, 24 pages. And I believe that could provide a good basis for the Finance in Common Summit that the IDFC and the government of France is organizing in November. We can discuss the possibilities of bringing that paper either as an agenda item or as a workshop, so that we can discuss and perhaps have a more solid commitments geared towards actual implementation of the recommendations that were outlined in the paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Salinas. I want to go directly to Ana Jaime, who brings more perspective from the urban planning and city perspective. Ana, how do these reactions, or how do these recommendations really work at that level? Do they make sense, or is there things that we're absolutely missing here?
Thank you, Alicia. Hi, everyone. I think everything that Boitumelo, Priscilla, Inga, and Edgar mentioned makes sense for me. And thank you for the Cities Alliance for the opportunity to collaborate in such a discussion. Here in Curitiba, we really feel the weight of the responsibility to reach the goals of Paris Agreement. So it's a big challenge. So every single alternative and strategy to help with this is very welcome. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the national development banks can indeed have an important role in supporting climate-smart urban infrastructure. But there's a lot of work to be done yet. Furthermore, I'm going to share some reflections based on my experience in Brazil. The Brazilian National Development Bank has a very good staff of technicians. Many of them recognize the importance of investments in climate change actions. The strategic goals of the bank aim to promote a transition to a resilient and low carbon economy and to support the climate resilience in the cities. The bank also is accredited by Green Climate Fund to fundraise financial resources for actions against climate change. Despite up to now, I don't have news if the bank obtained some resources, but are very good aspects. However, there's a space for improvements, such as increase the capacities in climate-smart urban infrastructure and prioritize this team to support the cities in project preparation. Having a more proactive approach with the cities to organize a portfolio of climate infrastructure projects and offering specific programs with more attractive loan charges and interest rates. But to all this happen, it's important to be aligned with national policy and goals. Unfortunately, in this moment in Brazil, the national government don't have prioritized this climate change. But I think this is important. In Brazil, very few cities have the capabilities to integrate climate in infrastructure. Only 4 cities in more than 5,000 cities, Curitiba, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Salvador, are committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement and are developing their climate action plans that I consider a very important instrument to help to leverage financial resources to the projects. This was only possible because of the support received from the C40 cities, which have provided training, consultancy, best practice, and share knowledge to drive meaningful, measurable, and sustainable action on climate change. Besides the C4 support, Curitiba has established cooperation with multilateral organizations as IDB, French Development Agency, Technical Cooperation Agency as GIZ, and international institutions as World Resources Institute to ensure the building capacities required to facilitate climate-smart infrastructure projects. Perhaps the NDBs can play the role of organizing this kind of support and incentivizing a network of cities committed to climate-smart urban infrastructure. I believe that could be a good strategy to create a pipeline of projects. What else? 7% of the Brazilian cities depend on more than 8% of external revenues, meaning state and federal transference. Since 2014, Brazilian cities are facing fiscal issues that might worsen with the pandemic. Therefore, the NDBs can support the cities with new financial mechanisms. As Boitumelo said, it's important innovation in this financial mechanism to leverage the financial resources, besides loans. Unfortunately, Brazilian cities can't issue bonds to finance infrastructure. Green bonds could be a great ally to increase investments in climate-smart urban infrastructure. And the Brazilian National Bank could help change this reality to the cities with creditworthiness. And another point that I'd like to bring is that the national development banks can help with advocacy with control institutions. At least in Brazil, these institutions can be a barrier to invest in new technologies. So I think that's it. This is my thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I actually think that is an excellent segue. Before we go into audience questions and answer, and I see we have a few participations and questions in the chat box now, I would actually encourage all who are on the line to continue putting your thoughts there, and we'll try to get to them in just a moment. But prior to actually going there, we do have on the line the co-chair of the Alliance's Enabling Frameworks Action Group, which I know has been hard at work to address some of the issues that you have mentioned, Ms. Jaime, in terms of, how to have national and city level priorities aligned and how that actually impacts financing. So Lori Kerr from the Global Infrastructure Facility, if you're on the line, I just invite you to share a few reactions to that, and then also how we will be able to continue this conversation, since obviously in the next 15 minutes we can't answer all of the great questions that we've raised here. Lori,
many thanks, Alicia. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes, I can. Yep.
Okay. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So thanks so much, Alicia, and thanks also to the discussion and the Alliance for such great insights that were just shared. So as Alicia mentioned, my name is Lori Kerr, and I'm with the Global Infrastructure Facility. Very briefly, the GIF is a 2014 G20 donor-funded initiative established to support, through both funding and hands-on technical expertise, multilateral development bank partners and emerging market governments at both national and subnational levels prioritize, plan, design, and structure pipelines of sustainable infrastructure investments that are attractive to private capital. Our current portfolio includes 93 infrastructure programs and projects across 47 emerging market countries, with total investment on the order of $70 billion, with more than half anticipated to come from the private sector. We've included in our new strategy at the GIF a special focus on urbanization and city infrastructure, and we're thrilled to be part of the Alliance and participate in really great conversations like this. And together with Andy Deacon from the Global Covenant of Mayors, I co-chair the Enabling Frameworks Action Group under the Alliance. And our action group draws from the diverse membership of the broader Alliance, and as the name implies, we seek to strengthen national, legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks that can boost climate finance for cities. And in that spirit, the policy brief that we've just been discussing today was prepared. And in addition to inspiring the great discussion we're about to have and the insights we've heard, that thought piece has also inspired follow-on work of the Enabling Frameworks Action Group. And as a next step, we are taking a deeper dive into national development banks and the nexus with municipal infrastructure and city climate finance, with the aim of taking the recommendations that Priscilla had outlined earlier that were included in the policy brief and creating practical and actionable solutions by using firsthand insights that we're going to gather both from national development banks and city officials. So that follow-on work also aims to further our common understanding of the challenges faced by NDBs, some of the things that we've heard today from Edgar and Butanello in financing low-carbon, climate-resilient infrastructure solutions, and also the factors that can lead to national development banks having an increased role in the municipal infrastructure and cities' climate finance space. And to that end, we're really pleased to announce that we'll be working with International Finance Consulting Limited with a great team led by Diana Smallwood. We're just kicking off the work, and we would welcome any and all national development banks or cities that are present in this conversation to please get in touch with the Secretariat, to Priscilla or Christina, if you'd like to find out more about the specific work we're doing or you're interested in participating, because we will be doing outreach and discussing with NDBs and cities. We're looking to include about a dozen NDBs and cities in the work that we're going to be undertaking. So please reach out to the Alliance if you're interested, or reach out to the Secretariat if you're interested in participating. And also, of course, if there are any other members of the Alliance who are not part of the Enabling Framework Action Group and are interested in participating, please join us. It's an exciting group and we're doing great work. So that's all for me. I see that I understand there's lots of questions that are being posted, so that's enough for me. I'd love to get to the conversation and the reflections from the audience on the policy brief that was presented today. So thank you so much, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Lori. And I'll ask one of my colleagues to actually put into the chat box the email for the Secretariat too, if you would like to be a part of those ongoing conversations. We would really welcome that perspective. So I do want to, we have a few more minutes and I'd like to get to at least a few audience questions here, and any that we don't get to, we will try to wrap into the takeaways from the event. So I see a question from Mr. Jerry Muscat from EIB. And I'll direct this actually first to Priscilla as a study author, but if any of our panelists would like to as well weigh in from the more direct perspectives, we would love to hear from you as well. At EIB, Mr. Muscat says that we have found that sometimes municipal banks or national development banks can lend to cities, but cannot lend to municipal utility companies or municipal housing companies. And that is actually where much of the urban climate investment is needed. And so, Priscilla, I'll turn to you on whether we looked at this issue at all, whether it's widespread, first of all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alicia. I think my answer will be quite short. We haven't looked at it into detail in this specific paper. In this, like, we highlighted the main issues and the main barriers, but definitely this point is quite important. As Lori just mentioned, we are looking now into going a little bit deeper into this work, and actually a lot of the activities that we're planning in the Alliance have to do with National Development Bank, and we'll make sure that this specific topic will be covered in these other studies. Like something that I mentioned, but it's important also to highlight that we know that national development banks are very different and they face specific problems in each barriers and opportunities in each country. And we know that this is probably a main barrier for some of them. So we'll make sure to work and look at it. Thanks.
Thank you. And Mr. Salinas or Ms. Mosaka, I'll just pause for a second if you have any reactions to that question that are more direct to, you know, we have the pleasure of having several regions here, so quick poll on that.
Well, hi, thank you. Just a quick reaction from our side in our experience here in Brazil. We haven't seen a manifestation of that constraint that is mentioned in the question. Both CAF as a DFI and those state-level banks have a mandate to engage with the utility companies. Here in Brazil, in most cases, what happens is that would be either a public sector loan, if that service is in the hands of the municipality, or something that we are seeing and more, and that was also mentioned in the paper, would be a PPP, a public-private partnership. So in either case, the state-level banks, they do have the mandate to engage in business, in contrast with the PPPs, and us, we can also have a loan operations with the PPPs if the amount and the conditions are met. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we have another question, and it's addressed actually more specifically to Mr. Salinas and Ms. Mosako, which is this main issue that we hear again and again, which is, okay, so on one side, we hear that there's not enough finance, but on the other side, maybe there are simply not enough bankable projects. And this audience member is mentioning particularly on adaptation projects. So the question here is, you know, what more can be done, or how can we then go about developing investment-ready proposals and building capacities, whether that's project preparation or elsewhere, at both the regional and national level? I know some of your remarks already got a bit to those, but I think if you could provide a little bit more detail on what your banks are doing for project preparation, or where you've seen other bright spots there, that would be quite helpful, and particularly again on adaptation projects. So Ms. Masako, I see you're unmuted, so I'll assume that that's okay to go directly to you now.
Yes, thanks, Alicia. I think, that is one of the key, elements around this, in a sense that you would hear investors saying that, there is money available, but there isn't, bankable projects. And that's where project preparation plays a key role, in terms of how these projects are, are actually prepared and de-risks to be able to then, crowd in funding. So that's why even as a, as a development bank, we do focus on project preparation and making sure, that we prepare the projects, we do the necessary studies, the necessary models, to then be able to make sure that we can package the projects. And what is key as well around this, Alicia, is how then you then fund the projects, because that's quite key. I mean, what we finding now, is that even though you can have you can issue a green bond, the challenge we have is, there's a compliance cost, to the issuance of these bonds, but yet, the pricing benefit is also not coming through yet. So I really think we especially with the private sector players, is around, how we really address the pricing elements around, the climate adaptation project, because there should be an element of a price benefit around that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I guess just to Priscilla, anything from the paper on this topic as well? I know we talk a bit about technical assistance there, but anything else you wanted to mention?
Yes, I think maybe highlighting the idea, particularly on the need and of project preparation for cities. So we have been working in the Alliance specifically in that topic through an action group that we have on project preparation. And we know that there's a major need for technical assistance to cities to implement large and complex infrastructure projects. And we know we have mentioned it in the paper, but national development banks can have a key role. A lot of them have sectorial expertise, and I think something that Anna mentioned on prepared staff to do bits of that work and even help funding some of the work. So we think there is an important role there. So just adding it up.
Great, thank you very much, Priscilla. And Edgar or Anna, I would just like to pause to see if you have any further reactions here.
I do. Hi, here Edgar with CAF again. I agree with what Boitumelo mentioned, and I think the straightforward answer to that question is that it's not a myth. It is true that there is a financing available, but not always we do find projects that are bankable. And in respect to that particular issue that is addressed in the question, adaptation projects are very challenging. According to the common principles to track climate finance in adaptation, you require a solid basis that explains and justifies that there is a climate risk and there is a society or a system that is exposed to that hazard from climate change. And for that, you need a project that is structured specifically, and I'm referring to the project documentation, the contract, the conditions, have to say it explicitly that the project is being financed and is being implemented to address that issue. And ultimately, you have to demonstrate that there is a correlation between the risk and your project. So that is what the common principles for adaptation finance tracking specify, and that's not always easy to address in the documents. So now something important that Priscilla and Boitumelo as well mentioned is the need for pre-investment facilities. In CAF, so far, we have developed pre-investment facilities, the Vice Presidency for Infrastructure, as well as the VP for Sustainable Development. We do have those facilities, and the idea is not to be a passive project taker, but engage with the clients in developing countries that can address issues from a more holistic perspective. I think pre-investment was also another recommendation from the paper, and again we concur with those conclusions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and something that we at CPI and the Alliance have been looking at quite a bit as well, with some the more successful instruments out there, certainly preparing for on the early stages of things as well. I am very sorry that we are already reaching the top of the hour, and so while we have many good questions, we will need to take this discussion offline, so to speak. I will ask again that one of my colleagues, it looks like Christina, thank you for adding the Secretariat email into the chat box. We will be continuing much of this discussion towards a more practical level within that Enabling Frameworks Action Group. So I do invite you to get in touch if you'd like to be a part of that. And then also stay tuned on the citiesclimatefinance.org website and elsewhere for more news upcoming about what more can be done in this really important area. I do want to just again thank all of our speakers for the great insights, as well as the authors of this paper and the co-hosts of this webinar, but also the co-leads on this, Felicity and GIZ, and also our funders from the German government through BMU and BMZ. We will have a recording of this webinar available on citiesclimatefinance.org. And again, I invite any further questions to come through that Secretariat email, and we will do our best to address them. But with that, I will have to conclude this webinar, and thank you all again for your participation.
Thank you. And to the team as well.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.